The fundamental strength of a business lies in its ability to tackle problems nobody else has thought about. Carmen Daniel Jones was forced to think of a solution when, while in university, she befell an unfortunate accident. For some reason, this student, with fantastic grades and extracurriculars, who had all her ducks in a row, more so than the average person, was unable to get a job. She eventually studied the significant scale of the disability market and is currently the CEO of marketing of the Solutions Marketing Group. I apologize, a marketing consulting firm that targets the disabled and attempts to level their playing field. What I find truly remarkable about this is the amount of grit and resilience that she had to exhibit to not only cope with the misfortunes that befell her, but to rise above them by tackling them head on. The tremendous effort and absolute brilliance of this accomplishment just baffles the mind. Ladies and gentlemen, Carmen Daniel Jones.
Who is he talking about? Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I am delighted to be with you all today. And as I drove up and I saw these bright faces that were smiling at me, I thought, gosh, our future is really, really bright. So I commend you all because I shared with my colleagues when I was a sophomore in college, I wasn't thinking entrepreneurially. I was thinking about getting to the party, making sure I had what I needed. But I know you all have that mixed and interspersed in your activities, but I commend you. So my journey to entrepreneurship was unconventional, as was shared with you. And it really probably started when I was a young girl, and what I'm going to share with you will predate you all, many of your birth. So I started my first market research project in the 70s how many of you have heard of the Partridge Family? Okay, a few. Okay. So that was a music group. And then the Jackson 5. How many? Yeah. Okay. All right. So we got that. So I wanted to go around my neighborhood and find out which group did my neighbors prefer, the Jackson 5 or the Partridge Family. And I went and knocked on doors, which when I look back, that was so entrepreneurial of me because I was about 10 years old. But after that time, I really didn't have this vision of being a business owner. And then, as was shared with you, when I was a junior in college at Hampton University, I was involved in a car accident that changed my life irreparably. I was in the hospital for 6 months. I returned to school less than a year after the accident, and I had to learn everything new. I mean, I had to learn how to do things like get up and down stairs. They made you practice in case there was an emergency getting downstairs in your chair. I had to learn how to drive. I had to learn how to get dressed even, how to take care of personal needs, how to shop, all of those things that go with taking a 5'10" body and having it seated. I remember being at the hospital, and after my surgery, I asked my physician, on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you rate, with 10 being the highest, of my chance of walking again? And he said, I would say about a 1. And I was really devastated because this became a very overwhelming thing in terms of what would life look like. When I returned back to college, my friends helped me regain my footing as a co-ed, and my brother was also a freshman, an incoming freshman at Hampton. And so that helped a lot with just adjusting back to life. And I, just resumed, and my friends adjusted, and we just figured out how to make it all work. Again, my disability just became a part of my life. And I was uncertain about what employment would look like for me, because this was in the 80s. This was in 1986-87, which predated the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And when I was trying to find work my senior year, my college didn't really have I was the only undergraduate student that was visibly disabled on campus, and my college didn't prep me for what going to work looked like. And so I went to interviews and I had people ask me a lot of inappropriate questions like, what's your, they'd scour through my resume, and you all know those good resume, the interview type questions, and they would say, well, what's your chance of walking again? I think they wanted to know if this was temporary or permanent. Or they would say, can you move your feet? What's your prognosis? Can you move your feet? And I was like, now I know I would own those companies, but I didn't know then, because my goal was to make them comfortable with me. So there was an article written about me in a local paper, and someone read it who ran a nonprofit. This was a big shift in my career path. And when I graduated, I didn't have a job. And my parents were loving, sweet folks, but like many of your parents, they're saying, you're going to get a job. And so I ended up being hired by a nonprofit organization, and I was counseling people with disabilities. And this was less than 2 years after my accident. So I didn't really embrace being a part of this group, but I needed a job, to be honest. And I made a whopping, this is scary, $16,000 a year. And counseled people to help them achieve their independent living goals. The beautiful thing about what happened is, as I counseled them, I was also counseling myself. I was also able to see what was possible. So I was there for a couple years, and I knew that I would not be a long-term employee, because I just decided I needed more. I ended up moving to the Washington, D.C. area, and I accepted a job in the federal government, and I worked in a variety of agencies. But I still maintained, my major was marketing. I had this marketing itch. So I left to join a private sector company called Evan Kemp Associates, which was in Capitol Heights, Maryland. And Evan Kemp, for those of you who want to Google, was a commissioner at the EEOC. He was a wheelchair user. He was a Bush appointee, and he was one of the advocates that really was a proponent for the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I went to work at EKA and rose to become the vice president of marketing there, which was exciting because Mr. Kemp always said to us that people with disabilities, at that time there were about 46 million, people with disabilities will be a factor to corporations once people understand the money that they have to spend. And it was with that seed that he, shared with me. He said, every other group, African Americans, women, companies pay attention to their consumer purchasing power, but not people with disabilities. And so one day I was returning to the office, and I took what he shared with me and I made it personal. And I said, as a woman and as a person of color, companies target me, but not as an individual with a disability. And it was with that insight and noticing that gap that I started my company. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I do and the massive size of the disability market. Just by a show of, or someone could call out to me, how many people do you think in this country have a disability? Anybody? Go ahead. 60 million, okay. Good guess. Anybody else? 45%. So it's 56 million people in the United States with over $1 billion in discretionary spending. 1 in 5 people, and if I even said, how many of you in this room have a loved one with a disability or a friend? By show of hands, let me see. Okay. So that's about a third. A third of the families in this country report having a family member with a disability. And when you look at, there's been this shift with focus on autism and the prevalence and how small the numbers are now. 1 in 68 children are born with autism. So if you have a market this size and scope, it leaves this gap if companies are not targeting them, not only for as consumers, but also as prospective employees, because the unemployment rate of people with disabilities is double that of the general public. It takes a person who has a disability, and I'm sharing this with you all so when you're in decision-making positions, which won't be too long, you can have an open mind as you see slates of candidates and you challenge people in your organization and say, you know what? We need to make sure that we have people with all differing, not just race, gender, and ethnicity, but also to include and integrate people with disabilities into your pool of candidates. So I started this company when I recognized the void. I started, honestly, very naively. I was not as, my process for how I started the company wasn't as sophisticated as the presenter before me, but I knew there was a need. So I recognized that need. And I knew that if companies had to comply with the ADA and with the Rehab Act, that why don't we leverage that opportunity and create some bottom line results. So my very first client was American Express. And let me tell you, if you're gonna have a first client, that is a good client to have. and it lent itself credibility for me. A lot of clients came after that. So AOL was a client. Darden Restaurants, which is the parent company for Red Lobster and Bahama Breeze and Capital Grille, that they became a client. And it was really exciting. You know, the business was really starting to flourish and take off. Around that time, I also, in intervening time, I got married. I was pregnant, had a child. And when my child was born, this was a little bit of a change in my plan and path. My child was born with significant disabilities, unrelated to mine, but he was born with significant disabilities related to his respiratory system and breathing. And Marcus spent a year in the NICU. Now, you can imagine I was a bit overwhelmed and a little bit discouraged because I thought, you know what, I've punched this adversity ticket already. But what I saw in this whole process is that my parenting him gave me the ability to serve my clients better. Because I now had firsthand experience in terms of what families want. They want their children to be, they want to have, many families have typical children or non-disabled children, and they may have a disabled child. And they want to have the ability to seamlessly do things together, or shop together, or travel together. And so I remember when my aha came when I was working with a client in Florida, and Marcus was probably about a year or two. And this healthcare company came to me and they said, we need you to help us reach families who have disabled children throughout the state. Well, it was a wonderful, opportunity, and there was market research and a whole market strategy that we developed. But in my hotel room, I had my aha of, okay, I get why Marcus is in my life, because I can serve these people, this client, better. So I guess one of the entrepreneurial insights I would offer is that when your personal life takes a detour from, the professional path that you're on, look for the opportunity in that. Look for the opportunity to understand where there's a need or fill some sort of gap that exists. So let me fast forward a little bit. So I was working in the company up in 2008. There was a little-known senator from the state of Illinois who decided he wanted to run for president. And from the moment he announced his candidacy, I was a supporter. I was hooked. And so I did some work with my peers in the disability community to help galvanize the disability vote. And so the result of that snowballed into, Carmen, we want you to go and speak at the platform hearing in Cleveland to share about disability issues. And I thought, okay, this is wild. So I went to Cleveland for a 5-minute talk. This talk here is longer than I had then. And I shared, and I told them what the prevailing issues were for the disability community. And the goal of those hearings were to help the candidate and the party determine what issues they wanted to get behind. I shared, and I thought, gosh, this was a really cool experience. Well, around the same time, the country was in an economic downturn, and my business started to slow down tremendously. And so I was working with AT&T and another healthcare company at the time, and also Darden at the time. And then, when that shift occurred, I wasn't ready. I just wasn't ready. And so I had to begin looking at opportunities elsewhere. And after President Obama's inauguration, some folks came to me and said, you know what, the administration really wants a diverse slate of candidates. Why don't you throw in your resume? And literally at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, I submitted, I hit send. Thursday, I got a call. The next week, I was headed to an interview at the Department of Agriculture, where I was hired 10 days later. They said, oh, it'll take 6 months to do the clearance and the background check, and it took 10 days. So that was supposed to be. And so while I was working at USDA, I had the awesome privilege of working with minority farmers in the South, in Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, and helping to provide, it was very different than the work I did previously in my company, but helping to provide equity of access to USDA services and also opening up new markets. I was later promoted and became the director of the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, which helped me open the doors wider for small businesses to come to USDA. It was also a perfect placement for me because it helped me understand government contracting, which I now use in my business. So I left, I was there 6 years, I served a little over 6 years, and I left the department in February of 2016. A lot of exciting projects came flooding me, and so I was able to return back. And we've had the privilege of still working with AT&T, we're working with Blue Cross Blue Shield in Texas. Also, a big break came in working with a large government prime contractor, and they asked us to sub. So, okay, thank you. So I just wanted to share a few insights with you all that I think may help along your journey to entrepreneurship. I guess the first thing, and I guess by virtue of my life experience, I would say to you all, the first thing that came to mind was to embrace the difficulty. Life, you're young, bless your hearts, you're young, and there will be some peaks and valleys. It's just how life goes. And you have a decision to make about how you encounter them. And so I learned once I stopped repelling against the difficulty and I started to embrace it and lean into it, then I began to see my life's work and life's purpose open up. The second thing is detours are an opportunity to create a new path. There is no way you would have told me, if you could have told me, you'll be working for a president, you'll go to the White House, you and your daughter will go into the Oval Office and meet the president and go to all these events. There's no way that I could have ever forecasted that. And so when my new path was created, I still had the desire and the interest and the energy to get back to my business. But now that I went on that short path at USDA, I have what I need to run my business more successfully and to also take a deeper dive into government contracting. So that was exciting. There is a book by an author named Simon Sinek called, Start With Why. So many of you have to be clear when you're an entrepreneur, what is your why? It can't, as Dave shared, you can't always just be about money, but what additional value can you add? Because on the days that you do not feel like being an entrepreneur, which are many, you have to understand why you're doing it. And for me, at the core of who I am, the reason I'm doing this is because right now I know that there's some family, maybe in Minnesota or California, who's trying to figure out, where are we going to go for vacation? And it's my job to work with the company. I'm put in a proposal last week to the Dominican Republic, who's embraced accessible tourism. And they want people to make a decision to come there for vacation. So that, for me, is the big why. So other families can have access and see themselves in messaging and see themselves as employees of companies. So nobody has to go through what I went through with 31st interviews, 2 second jobs, 2 second job interviews, and I had no job when I graduated. So I had to really stay focused on my why. And then another, and you may hear some leaders talk about it, you know, it feels a little squishy, but you got to stay in a place of thankfulness and gratitude, because on the days that you don't feel like doing this, you got to stay true to that. And then lastly, it's a question that a life coach posed to me that I will share with you all. When you're doing your work, and even now, just ask yourself this question: how is someone's life better as a result of crossing my path? And I want to make sure that the companies that I work with, while I know that they want to make money, and I want them to make money targeting the disability market, I want people's lives to be better as a result. Thanks so much.